Hello and welcome. I'm Donna Rutherford, and I hope you're going to enjoy a short talk about my ancestors who were considered settlers into the New Zealand province of Taranaki. I currently live in London, but my DNA, and specifically my mum's DNA, is very much linked to all the settler families of Taranaki from the mid-1800s. Now, I must remind you that these are my own views and opinions, not those necessarily of FamilySearch International and RootsTech. And my first opinion is that having DNA from a settler population is both interesting and frustrating, as I'm going to demonstrate to you. But firstly, I need to tell you where Taranaki actually is in New Zealand. So it's on the west coast of the North Island, and I often explain to people it's kind of the bit that sticks out. Now, in the bit that sticks out is something anyone who's been to Taranaki or is from Taranaki will recognise, and that's our mountain, Mount Taranaki. It's right in the middle of the province and it's visible from everywhere if it's not raining. You might recognise it as the stand-in for Mount Fuji in the Tom Cruise film The Last Samurai, and that was filmed all around Taranaki. It's not Mordor for any Lord of the Rings fans. That's actually another mountain in the middle of the North Island. The main city of Taranaki is near Plymouth. It's a relatively large urban population of over 57,000. It's actually the 13th biggest city in New Zealand, and it's where I was born and bred. At the time the Europeans arrived in New Zealand, it was of course home to Maori, the indigenous Polynesian people. And Maori had arrived in New Zealand roughly around 1320 to 1350, coming in walkers in various voyages. European settlers, they all came in sailing ships, and the first settler ship started arriving in Taranaki in 1841. There's actually 6 recognised first ships arriving between 1841 and 1843. The William Bryan, the Amelia Thompson, the Oriental, the Tamandra, which my ancestors were on, and then followed by the Blenheim and Essex. Most ships, many other ships actually followed these, but of course these are recognised as the first ships. The Tamandra left Plymouth in England heading for New Plymouth, so they just stuck a new in front of where they left. They left November 1841 and arrived about 4 months later into Taranaki. The ship had 202 passengers, and sadly there were 6 deaths during the voyage, not unusual for that time period. There was actually 5 births on board, and the medical comforts they were carrying were interesting. There was oatmeal, pressed beef, sugar, port wine, sherry wine, brandy, arrowroot, lime juice, scotch, barley, stout, and rum. Quite the cocktail cabinet of medical comforts. And here's the passenger list I sourced from FamilySearch. The passenger list shows my 4 times great-grandparents, Samuel Cran and his wife Sarah. Samuel and Sarah came with their children, William, George, Henry, Elizabeth, and Matilda. They all made the voyage. And here's my family tree. So Matilda is my direct ancestor. She's my 3 times great-grandmother. And on the voyage, as per the passenger list, you'll note the next one there, William. William is called William Perrott in New Zealand. More on that, so don't go away, because we're going to solve the mystery of who William Perrott's father is. He was called William Cran on the passenger list. Next is George. Now, George sadly died in 1848 when he was swimming from a ship. He was 21, but interestingly, he's registered as the first European drowned by the sea. Other children, Elizabeth, Anne, and John, sadly had all died young before their voyage to New Zealand. Henry Cran was next to make the voyage, and unfortunately, he met his end in the New Zealand Wars. But I do have a little bit about his son further on, so stay tuned for that as well. And then Elizabeth also sadly drowned in New Zealand. She was only 14 years old, and she drowned in one of the local rivers, the Waiwakaio. And lastly, the youngest to make the trip was my 3 times great-grandmother, Matilda Cran. So once the settlers arrived in New Zealand, they needed to populate. The population of Taranaki did grow, not just from the arrival of new settlers though, but also by marrying within this new settler community from those families off the first 6 boats. And as part of this, there were sometimes cousin marriages, quite normal for the time, and often several marriages between families on nearby farms. All the settler families started to become quite intertwined. So what does that mean when we look at our DNA? So when we're using DNA to back up our paper trails, what happens with settler communities? Well, firstly, let's look at the ethnicity estimate. So these are my mums. The first one on the left is from Ancestry. And my mother has here the New Zealand Taranaki region, European and British settlers community. So we'll just remind ourselves that the genetic communities are basically genetic networks within all the DNA, within all the DNA kits of the database. Clearly they cluster together in various ways. And from those DNA clusters, they're able to annotate those clusters by looking at the trees of the matches that are connected into them. So mum therefore very clearly connects into the New Zealand Taranaki region settler group. Now in late 2020, MyHeritage also released a genetic groups, so also used genetic clusters. And again, my mother has the group New Zealand Taranaki. So in both the new MyHeritage genetic groups and in the Ancestry genetic communities, mum falls into the Taranaki settler groups. Moving on to her match list, you may be familiar with auto clusters. This is available at MyHeritage and also on GEDmatch as a tier 1 option. The tool's also available direct at Genetic Affairs website, and I definitely want to give them a shout out, as clustering is one of the best ways of managing our DNA matches. It means we create our own genetic networks within our match list, looking at those matches that share DNA with each other. Now, in most cases of doing an auto cluster report, it will look a little bit like that chart on the left, where you get some nice boxes. People clearly fit into one box or another. Now, if you come from a settler population or have even some sort of endogamy within your family, you'll get a box that looks, a chart that looks more like my mum's here on MyHeritage, the chart on the right. You have one huge cluster of matches. And even people in the small clusters also connect into the big cluster. And you can tell that by all the little grey cells. All those little grey matches all mean they also match into the big box, the big cluster. And I know, of course, from my research, that big cluster is full of all people who have descended from the settler families. But can we solve family mysteries if we have such intermingled groups of families? Well, one enduring mystery in our family, in the Cran family, is the parentage of William Perrott. So he was on the passenger listed as William Cran, but once in New Zealand, he went by the name Perrott, as did his descendants. William was born before civil registration, so we don't have a birth certificate to look at. But if we go back to the parish registers, we can find William's baptism there. I'm not sure if you can read it, but it's there on the left. He was baptised in the parish of Allington. At the time, his mother, Sarah Perrott, was a spinster. So he was actually an illegitimate birth. So we know his mother is Sarah Perrott, but we need to solve who his biological father is. Now, firstly, we collected up the matches from all our known legitimate branches of Samuel and Sarah Cran. So, for example, my descendants who come from Matilda Cran, where we know that she was William's child based on the records. Now, one of the, Samuel's child based on the records, so Samuel and Sarah Cran. One of the interesting things we found was we have matches to people in Newfoundland. Now, some traditional research has now uncovered that the paper trail of the Cran family in Newfoundland matches the paper trail of the Cran family in New Zealand. This is a register of births from the Methodist Church in St. John's, Newfoundland. About a third of the way down there, you can see there's a John and Elizabeth Cran. And again, I'm sorry, it's difficult to read these old records. And they've given birth to a daughter, Jane, in Newfoundland. Now, using genealogy records, we've confirmed that John Cran was in fact the brother of Samuel Cran. So one brother's gone to New Zealand and the other to Newfoundland. I often use this joke in some of my presentations that I think they must have just gone down to the ship. They both said, we're going somewhere new. One's jumped on board to New Zealand, the other's jumped on board to Newfoundland. So it's no surprise that the descendants of Samuel Cran and Sarah Perrott have DNA matches to this Cran family, to the Cran families in Newfoundland and obviously their descendants. And I have found that specifically in my mum's family, of course, we descended from Matilda Cran. We know she was a legitimate child of Samuel Cran. And we have many matches back to the descendants of the families in Newfoundland. But what about the descendants of William Perrott? Well, we actually found they also matched the descendants of the Cran families in Newfoundland. Now, we know there's no other way that William Perrott, looking at all the genealogy, we know there's no other way that these descendants could have a Cran family. If we found any marrying into the Cran family, they were simply ignored for this exercise. So those that had no other connections to the Cran family also matched the Cran families from Newfoundland. So we can say it's fairly likely that William Perrott's real father was in fact Samuel Cran. And in fact, Samuel Cran and Sarah Perrott married very soon after William's birth. You might say, why couldn't we work that out by just looking at the descendants of Matilda and the descendants of William to see if we were full cousins or half cousins? But let me remind you why we couldn't do that. And that's this huge settler cluster, the settler effect, sometimes called the founder effect. So it's not straightforward because of all the interconnections between the family. The founder effect, the National Human Genome Research Institute described this effect as the reduction in genetic variation that results when a small subset of a large population is used to establish a new colony. And of course, what that means is it's not straightforward when we try and compare matches between the descendants of these settler families. And I know some kits I've worked on where I can see 10 different ways that the match and the person is connected. So it's not as simple as just checking whether somebody is a half or full cousin. Let's look at another Cran example, see where we might find the kit of someone with the settler effect. So we're going to look at Henry Cran. Now, you remember Henry Cran was the son of Samuel and Sarah who came on the Tamandra, and he was killed during the New Zealand Wars. He's actually buried in St Mary's Church graveyard, the very first church in New Plymouth, right in the middle of New Plymouth, and his grave is there in the churchyard. He died after he was married. He had a son, and he called his son Henry Cran as well. And Henry Cran married Mary Roberts. Now, I have DNA matches to descendants of Henry Cran and Mary Roberts. So clearly I'd expect them to be maternal matches from my Cran DNA into my mum's Cran family that were the Taranaki settlers. But strangely, this match also matches into my paternal side. Where does my paternal DNA come from with this match? Well, using traditional research, I was able to trace Mary Roberts. So Henry Cran married Mary Roberts, and I was able to trace this back to my dad's family. Mary Roberts is in fact my dad's great-great-grandfather's daughter. Now, often when people see a DNA match that's clearly maternal and paternal, they immediately start to get concerned their parents are close relatives. And in most cases, that's not actually the reason. It's just there's two different branches involved, and the descendants of those two different branches are going to match you on both your maternal and paternal side. And that's the case with this match. So my parents are not related. It's just these matches are related from Henry Cran and Mary Roberts, who happen to come from two different sides of my family. Henry Cran from my maternal settler side and Mary Roberts from my dad's Roberts side. Now, the Roberts are considered settlers of New Zealand, but they came 20 years after the Crans. They didn't arrive in any of the first 4 boats. They arrived into New Zealand in 1861, but were still considered settlers. Now, sticking with the Roberts family, this is one of the last pictures I'm going to show you, but it's a fantastic picture, and it's actually hanging in the library in New Plymouth. And it's the last surf boat landing in New Plymouth in 1884. And this is courtesy of the Pukeariki Heritage Collection. If you have interest in Taranaki, the Pukeariki Heritage Collection is absolutely fantastic and has some amazing photos, and you never know what you're going to find there. So if you look at the man third from the left, he's very hard to see, and he's standing on his side, and his name was Samson Roberts. He's actually listed in the archives as Sam Roberts for this photo, but he is the brother of Mary Roberts, who married into our Cran family. So, a question to the audience, any of you from Taranaki? I hope some people from Taranaki are tuning into this. If you're from Taranaki, I manage a small Facebook group called Taranaki Families, Genealogy and DNA. At the moment, we've got nearly 920 members. We are a growing group. You don't have to have DNA tested to join the group. We happily talk about connections amongst our families. We share stories, photos, and lots of information on our genealogy, and also a lot about the bit Taranaki and the settler days. If you have tested DNA and you're from Taranaki, then I do have an ancestor project at GEDmatch. If you haven't seen the ancestor projects at GEDmatch, you can log on and you can apply to have your kit added to the group, and you can compare your DNA kit at GEDmatch to the other people in the project. So this is mine. It's open to anyone from the Taranaki with ancestry from the Taranaki province in New Zealand, and we support that in our chat in the Taranaki Families Genealogy and DNA Facebook group. And the aim, of course, is to further our genealogy research into the families of Taranaki. And as you've seen during the talk, actually being able to pull our information and our matches, we can start to solve mysteries and puzzles. So in summary, DNA research, the settler effect can be interesting and difficult. We can still solve family mysteries, but it really helps to work with a group of people to solve these genealogical puzzles together. You could actually start your own group. You can start your own group based on your own specific area or interest, your family group, a location, a surname you're interested in. Get your Facebook group together, start to recruit members, get them into projects, start working on sharing your kits with each other. You know, at Ancestry, you can give other people viewer access to your kit. Start working together to help solve these mysteries and puzzles. And lastly, I want to thank you for listening in. There's several ways here of contacting me. If you're interested in DNA, I do run a UK DNA group. It's called, on Facebook, it's called DNA Help for Genealogy UK. And please feel free to join up by that. Want to thank you all for listening. If you've got any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me. And I hope that you think about using these ways with grouping together people who are interested in the same genealogical location or families, working together to help you use DNA to further your genealogy. So again, thank you very much for listening in. I'm Donna Rutherford, and that was the DNA of the Taranaki settlers. Thank you.